Hi everybody and welcome to the first video in a series of videos which will be exploring theme 3.5. So we're going to be looking here at labour markets. Now what we're going to focus on first of all is the demand for labour. And this is a really nice revision of what we've looked at in 1.2 when we looked at market theory such as demand and supply. All we're doing here, we are applying the same theory to labour markets. So a really, really important thing you need to understand from the word go, that when we're looking at labour markets, it's businesses that demand your labour. So it's businesses that will demand your workers. You as individuals will choose to supply your labour. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the demand for labour then, first of all. And as a reminder, the demand for labour ultimately is businesses demanding your labour. Now, what you'll see is on the diagram, rather than having price and quantity, we're going to be looking at wage rate and the quantity of labour employed. So wage rate against quantity of labour employed. Now, it's worth noting as well that the demand for labour is a derived demand. Now, all derived demand means, it means that the demand for labour is based off of the demand for the output produced. So, for example, if you work in a cafe, the reason why you are demanded is because people are demanding the food that the cafe produces. If you've got family that work in factories, their demand for them is based off the demand for the things that they produce. So your demand for A-level economics creates a demand for me as a teacher. Without you guys, the college would not demand my services. Now, what I've done here, I've drawn a demand for labour curve. So look at what you've got here. The relationship, a bit like a normal demand curve, is negative. So what we'd expect to see, if wage rates were to increase, there'd be a reduction in the demand for labour. If wage rates fell, there'd be an increase in the demand for labour. Now, just to point this out, look at the diagram. Let's imagine we start off at W1, Q1. So what we can see is that particular wage rate, firms will demand Q1 workers from across the economy. Now, if we were to see an increase in wage rates to W3, then we're going to have a contraction in the demand for labour. Now, think about why ultimately businesses will demand workers in order to produce the output, and ultimately that will give them profit. Well, if there was an increase in wage rates, the costs of production have increased. So that therefore means it's more difficult now for firms to be able to make profit from their workers. So we call this the income effect. Growth in wage rates will ultimately mean it's more difficult to make profit from workers. So we're going to get a contraction in demand. In other words, fewer workers will be demanded due to that growth in wage rates. Now we can also explain this contraction in demand through the substitution effect. Now you could argue that in lots of industries that capital is a substitute for labour. So for example, think about in a factory, we've got what we call automation, where more technology, more robotics, more machinery is doing the jobs of workers. So if workers start to become more expensive, then businesses will shift their demand towards these cheaper substitutes instead. Now clearly, if wage rates were to fall from W1 to W2, this time we will get an extension in the demand for labour. So as wage rates fall, firms will increase their demand for workers across the economy. And again, this is due to the income and substitution effect. The income effect would say that as workers become cheaper to employ, it would lower the cost of production. And that will therefore mean it's now more profitable to employ workers. So that increased the ability to make profits would extend their demand for workers. Now, further to this, we have the substitution effect. As workers become cheaper to employ, then firms would move their demand away from capital towards the now newer, cheaper workers across the economy. So, guys, you've got there a basic demand for labour curve. It's worth remembering that when we draw these, we're always drawing it on the assumption of ceteris paribus. So, in other words, the only thing that we are changing along that demand for labour curve is the wage rates. So if wage rates were to increase, we're going to get a contraction in the demand for labour. If wage rates fall, then we get an extension in the demand for labour. Right, okay, now what we've now got to be thinking about is a topic that, again, we looked at under 1.2. We looked in theme 1 at price elasticity of demand. And that was about the responsiveness of the demand to a change in prices. Now, what we can look at with labour markets is wage elasticity of demand. Now, the definition for this is very, very similar to what it would be for price elasticity of demand. It would be the responsiveness of the demand for labour to a change in wage rates. So in other words, how much will firms change their demand for workers as wage rates change? Now, again, when we look at this, we're making the assumption of ceteris paribus. The only thing that we're changing here is the wage rate to see how much that would affect the level of demand. So in other words, if wage rates were to increase, how much of a contraction in the demand for labour would there be? If wage rates fell, how much of an extension in the demand for labour would there be? Now, the formula for this, again, very, very similar to the PED formula. So to work out WED, the wage elasticity of demand, it's the percentage change in the demand for labour divided by the percentage change in the wage rate. Now, you've got then two main scenarios which you need to be aware about. Now, clearly we could have unitary demand for labour curves. We could have perfectly wage inelastic ones, perfectly wage elastic ones, but these are the two main ones that you need to be aware about. So I've drawn on the left-hand side of the page, first of all, a wage inelastic demand for labour curve. Now, what you can see here then is that we have an unresponsive change in demand. Now, from the formula, this would be via numbers 0 to -1. Now, look at the diagram. If we were to increase wage rates from W1 to W2, we're only going to get a small contraction in the demand for labour. So what that means is a significant growth in wage rates would lead to a very small contraction in the demand for labour. So what that would mean here is that the percentage increase in wage rates would exceed the percentage change in the demand for labour. Now, on the right-hand side, we've got a wage elastic demand for labour curve. We would say here that the demand for labour is responsive to a change in wage rates. So a bit like the PED formula, anything between -1 and -infinity would show a wage elastic demand for labour curve. And again, look at this. As wage rates grow from W1 to W2, the percentage fall in demand is now very significant. So what this now means is the percentage increase in wage rates exceeds that percentage. I beg your pardon, let me rephrase that. The percentage of fall in demand for labour exceeds that percentage increase in wage rates. Let me clarify that again. The percent change in demand for labour would exceed the percentage change in the wage rate. So this time we would get a really, really significant contraction in the demand for labour. Right, okay, now hopefully what you're now thinking about is, well, what would affect wage elasticity of demand? Now, look at this scenario again then. And let me just briefly recap what we've got. In this diagram, the demand for labour is wage inelastic. And hopefully what you can see here again is that we've got a very steep demand for labour curve, which means that a growth in wage rates would lead to a very insignificant contraction in the demand for labour. So here what we're saying is that firms are very reliant upon their workers. A growth in wage rates would not really affect their demand that significantly for their workers. Now, some of the possible reasons for this include these. It could be in the short run. Now, the idea would be, remember, that firms can technically, in most industries, replace workers with capital, but this isn't something that can happen in the short run. So, for example, if workers were to demand a pay rise in the short run, they're probably going to get it. It wouldn't really contract the demand for these workers. The reason for that is that employers would need time to adapt and move towards more capital. So the whole factory, the whole industry, the whole business might need re-engineering to become more capital intensive. It might take time to afford to buy the capital, install that capital. So that would mean to keep on producing in the short run, the demand for labour would have to still remain, even with a higher wage rate. Now, another reason could simply be that the output being produced by the workers has got a price inelastic demand. Now, remember, if you've got a price inelastic demand, if firms were to raise prices, it wouldn't really contract the demand for those goods and services. Now think about what that means then. If workers in these industries demand a pay rise, then the firm will feel confident passing on the extra cost onto the consumers, knowing it wouldn't really affect the demand for the output produced. Now, logically then, if the demand for the output produced is price inelastic, the demand for labour, which is derived from the demand for the output, would also be wage inelastic. So in summary, what we're saying here then is if workers demand a pay rise, they're going to get it, because the extra cost of those workers can simply be passed on to the consumers in terms of a higher price. We know the consumers will generally pay it still. The demand for labour may also be wage inelastic due to a lack of substitutes. So there are some industries where capital cannot replace workers. Now, in those industries, if capital cannot replace workers, again, it means that the workers are necessities. If workers become more expensive to keep on producing output, the firm has got to keep on paying them wages, because if they don't, they cannot easily move away to capital as a substitute product. Now, the final one is probably the most complicated one to explain. It's that labour forms a small proportion of the cost of production. Now, a simple way of thinking about it is this. If workers only make up, let's say, 5% of the cost of production, so that could mean the other 95% of the cost will be the cost of raw materials, the cost of capital, etc. Now, if in this instance here, if workers demand a pay rise, it's not really going to have a significant impact on the costs. Okay, so for example, if, and let me write this number down here, let me just find a different colour pen. If the cost of production for a firm are £50 for every unit of output produced, but workers make up only £1 of this. So only £1 out of the £50 cost of production is for the cost of workers. Now, technically, if workers demanded a 100% increase in wages, well, all that would mean is the cost of production of workers would now become £2, and that would only increase the cost of production to £51. Well, that's going to have a very minimal impact on the overall cost of production, and that will again probably mean that workers will be able to demand those high rates of pay without it really contracting their demand. And hopefully what you can see here then is that the wage elastic demand reasons are the exact opposite of the ones that we've mentioned. In the long run, well, the idea will be in the long run, if workers demand a pay rise, firms are more able to go away and find capital, change their whole industry to become more capital intensive rather than labour intensive, so they can be more responsive to that growth in wage rates. It could also be that the output produced is price elastic. Now think about why. If the output produced has got a price elastic demand, what the firms know, if they were to increase the prices of those products, it would have a massive contraction in the demand for those products. Well, that therefore means that if we were to hand workers a pay rise, we've got to raise prices, and that would have a massive impact on the demand for the output produced. It's therefore very difficult to give these workers this extra pay that they're demanding, and that would therefore make the demand for labour extremely wage elastic. It could also be there are lots of really, really good quality, really, really affordable substitutes for workers. So capital is readily available, workers demand a pay rise, we go, bugger you, we're going to shift our demand towards capital instead. Now, and then look at the final one. Labour forms a large proportion of the cost of production. Now look at the numbers that I included for that scenario on the left. Let's imagine again that the cost of production is 50 quid, but this time workers make up £30 of this £50. Now, if workers demanded a 100% pay rise this time, then suddenly workers will be getting £60, and that will increase the cost of production from 50 quid up to £80 instead. Well, that's going to have a really, really significant impact on the cost of production, and that will be difficult for firms to be able to give to their employees. So that will probably lead to a significant contraction in the demand for labour. Right, guys, now the last slide is this. Now, what we've been looking at then so far are movements along the demand for labour curve. So what we were looking at there was how a change in wage rates would affect the demand for labour. So what we know, if wage rates were to increase, then it's going to contract demand. If wage rates were to fall, it would extend the demand. And what we saw from wage elasticity of demand is we could see how much those contractions or extensions would be. What we've now got to be thinking about is what will make the demand for labour curve shift. Now, what I've got in these two diagrams, and look at the first one. In the first one, what we're showing is at the same wage rate, firms are now more willing and able to demand workers. So what we're doing now, we're holding wage rates constant, and we're just seeing how non-wage factors will influence the demand for labour. So let me write that down at the top of the page. So we're looking here at non-wage reasons why the demand for labour might change. So again, look at that first diagram. At the same wage rate, we've now got Q2 people being demanded as opposed to Q1. And again, what we can do, we can think about what has made this happen. So these are non-wage reasons, so you shouldn't be talking about wage rates changing when we show shifts in the demand for labour. Now, this could be caused by a growth in the demand for the output produced. Remember, the demand for labour is derived from the demand for goods and services. So the logic would be if firms have got growing demand for their output, they need more workers. So Subway sandwich shop have got more customers coming through the door, and ultimately Subway need more workers, don't they? And it really, really is as simple as that for that first one there. Now, a second reason is a growth in productivity. Now remember, to work out productivity of workers, it's the output produced in a given time period divided by the number of workers. Now think about what this means. If workers were to become more productive, so this could mean they've got better human capital, and all we mean by that is they've got better skills, they've got higher qualities about them, then what it would mean is for the same wage rate, we're going to get more output from our workers. Well, that therefore means that we can increase our output without having to increase the cost of workers. Well, that therefore means that workers are now more profitable to employ. We can make more money from them. So guys, the idea is if workers become better quality, they've got better what we call human capital, then ultimately it becomes more profitable to recruit people. So more people create businesses and recruit these people to benefit from these really, really high skilled workers that we've now got across the economy. Now, it could also be driven by a growth in profitability. Now, the idea is that when the economy is doing well and you've got growing demand for goods and services, then firms become more incentivized to produce. With the logic being all they can see is, well, the economy is doing well, the business is doing well, we've got this growth in profitability. It's incentivizing businesses to want to invest more. And if they start investing more money, then they're going to need more workers to keep up with those investments that they're now making. Now, the final one could be a growth in the price of substitutes. So if capital was to become more expensive, then at the same wage rates, firms will demand more workers. They'll get rid of capital and they'll move towards more labour instead. Now, everyone, in the second diagram, then what we're showing here is at the same wage rate, we've now got less people being recruited by businesses. In other words, for the same wage rate, firms become less willing and able to recruit workers. Now, this could be driven by a reduction in the demand for output. So this is the idea of the derived demand theory again. If there's falling demand for output across the economy, then less output's got to be produced, and businesses will get rid of what they would call their spare capacity. Okay, so if you're you're a factory making sandwiches, and there's a fall in demand for sandwiches, then you've got a load of workers that you no longer need, and you start to lower your demand for those workers across the economy. Now, the second one could be a fall in productivity of workers. If workers become less productive, maybe because they're now less skilled, they've got what we call lower human capital, then it will become more expensive to recruit your workers. Your costs have increased because ultimately for the same wage rate, you're now getting less production completed by your workforce. And if you're less able to make profits from your workers because they're less productive, you'll get rid of them. Now, another reason could be a reduction in profitability. If firms are becoming less productive, maybe because there's falling profits are falling because of falling demand across the economy, Then it could mean that price levels are falling across the economy as well. It's more difficult to make profits. Then firms will be looking for ways of reducing their costs. And that could mean that they lower their demand for workers. They get rid of workers to try and squeeze their costs to maintain some level of profitability. And of course, it could even just be driven by a reduction in the price or an increase in the quality of substitutes. So in this instance, if capital becomes cheaper or of high quality, then firms would reduce their demand for labour and start to instead demand more capital. And that would therefore, of course, shift the demand for labour inwards. Right, guys, well, that is the end of the demand for labour theory. What I would recommend that you do, you now practice, you draw all the diagrams that we've drawn in this video, and you start to think about why will the demand for labour be wage inelastic? Why will it be wage elastic? What will make the demand for labour curve shift outwards, and what will make it shift inwards? And then once you've done that, you have mastered the demand for labour. Thank you very much, everyone.